Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our US Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon of Sunday, November 30th, 2025. And this will be a special salon because it will double as my Chairman's anniversary message on the occasion of 9 years having elapsed already since I became chairman on November 17th, 2016. But also this will be an opportunity to engage with you, our viewers, because I have held question and answer sessions from time to time, and I have found them to be productive in addressing what matters to our members and our audience, anybody who is curious. So welcome, thank you for being here. And before I begin, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists who will be joining us live, including our Director of Visual Art, Ramon Garcia, our member from Texas who heads the Texas Transhumanist Party, Alan Crowley, and our Director of Citizen and Community Science, who also ran as our vice presidential candidate in the 2024 election, Daniel Tweed. So welcome, Ramon, Alan, and Daniel. And thank you, by the way, to Jennifer Hughes, who is in the chat. She writes, "We appreciate all you do for the party and the world, Gennady." I really appreciate that. And of course, Jennifer was our endorsed mayoral candidate for the city of Camden, New Jersey, back in 2021. She was the first person in about 50 years to challenge the Democratic Party monopoly over Camden, New Jersey, and she ran on an explicitly pro-life extension platform. So this was the first time we're aware of that a mayoral candidate in the United States had a pro-life extension platform. But now let us begin with my thoughts as regards the 9th anniversary of my becoming chairman of the United States Transhumanist Party at the request of Zoltan Istvan. So this 9th anniversary occurred on November 17th of this year, and the past year has been one of the most eventful during my tenure as chairman. Despite the conclusion of our Ross Tweed presidential campaign last year, 2025 has been anything but an off year for political activity, characterized both by macro turbulence in the United States generally, as well as both great opportunities and immense setbacks in the transhumanist and life extensionist community in particular. As often happens, we observed a rhyming of history this year as the USTP endorsed the candidacy of Zoltan Istvan for governor of California. Although he is officially running as a Democrat, many of his policies, including the promotion of an automated abundance economy, a universal basic income, the construction of new high-tech cities, and the use of technology to fight wildfires, are strongly aligned with the US Transhumanist Party platform. I have a link here to the Transhumanist Party platform, which I encourage any of you who have not read it yet to study thoroughly. But we are enthusiastic about Zoltan's campaign. We held a virtual enlightenment salon with Zoltan on June 15th, 2025, where we explored his stances in detail and asked him some challenging questions. Ultimately, our members determined by a wide margin that his campaign was indeed aligned with the USTP platform and objectives. And you can see the more detailed results of that vote at this link that I am sharing here, as well as the results of the other votes that we held concurrently that I will also discuss. Even in areas where Zoltan diverged from us, such as in some of his more pessimistic rhetoric about the potential impacts of artificial intelligence, it appears that this rhetoric served more as an initial hook to attract public attention, a technique that Zoltan often uses. Once he has that attention, he redirects it toward more techno-optimistic solutions, such as providing a humanoid robot for every home and harnessing AI for education so that humans do not get left behind in the upcoming technological transformation. Overall, despite some rhetorical differences, our members determined that Zoltan's campaign is transhumanist in substance, and Zoltan has remained a vocal proponent of radical life extension while continuing to publicly share the messaging of the US Transhumanist Party and the fact of our endorsement. We also anticipate highlighting his campaign using our media resources as 2026 gets underway. Zoltan Istvan is not the only candidate whom we endorsed, as during our member vote in August and September of 2025, Timothy Grady also earned our support. And Timothy Grady is running an independent campaign for governor of Ohio. You can see his policy page linked here. This campaign seeks to transcend the duopoly of left and right and bring economic, cultural, and political revitalization to the state of Ohio. And we also hosted a virtual enlightenment salon with Timothy Grady last Sunday on November 23rd, 2025, where he thoroughly delved into his vision for constructive policy solutions for Ohio and the workings of American politics more generally. He provided a call to urgent action, as in his view, we have since the 2008 global financial crisis been in an extended time window when paradigm-shifting ideas and innovations can take hold. But that time window may not last for much longer. And therefore, now is our time to shift the political discourse and public perceptions of what is possible. Otherwise, some far less palatable ideologies may take hold and shape the predominant forms of political life for multiple decades to come. The potential for a wide array of candidate endorsements was also opened by our entry into the All Hands for a Free Future political coalition with the US Pirate Party, which shares with us a strong appreciation for individual liberty, technological progress, and the pursuit of universal abundance. The Pirate Party will have candidates at the state and local levels in areas and for offices where there are likely to be no active transhumanist contenders. And the efficient cross-endorsement process made possible via the coalition will allow us to cast a wider net in pursuing our objectives through like-minded allies. Our virtual enlightenment salons with the US Pirate Party occurred on December 15th, 2024, when we hosted Captain Jolly Mitch DeVillo, and then on June 29th, 2025, when we hosted Captain Drew Bingaman of the US Pirate Party. These salons highlighted many areas of alignment, which led to this coalition becoming solidified in recognition of the significant efficiencies that can be gained through collaboration and cross-endorsement, while retaining our unique organizational characters, structures, and approaches to governance and membership. And I will stress that latter point because this is a coalition, it's an alliance, it's not a merger. The Transhumanist Party and the Pirate Party remain distinct political entities with their own governance, their own leadership structure, their own methods of decision making. And we will collaborate where we deem appropriate. And of course, the cross-endorsement process is there. And you can be on the lookout for news in the near future regarding how that cross-endorsement process will function, and some of the first candidates who will receive our support by means of it. So I think you will be interested to find out about some of these candidates whom the US Pirate Party has endorsed, as well as additional candidates who will be seeking the endorsement of our members in future votes. So in effect, there are two pathways by which candidates may receive our endorsement. One would be to approach us and ask for a vote of the US Transhumanist Party members, as we have done historically, to endorse that candidate. Or if that candidate is seeking the endorsement of the US Pirate Party and the Pirate Party approves that person's candidacy through their own process, we will essentially grant reciprocal recognition to the US Pirate Party's action in making that endorsement. Also, in April and May of 2025, I was honored to attend 4 of the 8 Vitalist Bay conferences. Vitalist Bay occurred this year in Berkeley, California, and there were 4 conferences in particular that I attended: the Longevity Science Conference, the Vitalist Bay Summit, the Biostasis Conference, which focused on cryonics, and the Longevity Policy Conference, all at the Lighthaven facility in Berkeley, which is quite unique and interesting. These were gatherings of great minds that also facilitated in-depth intellectual exchange and the beginnings of coordination on policy activism and movement building in a field which is too often still siloed, and where individual projects, while excellent and promising in themselves, may be lacking in support from a community and a network that would both spread information about them and benefit from their successes, as we all benefit from longer and healthier lives. In particular, on May 25th, 2025, at the Longevity Policy Conference, I delivered my presentation, Why Openly Transhumanist Politics is Needed for Vitalism to Succeed. I think this is an extremely important presentation for USTP members to watch. It provides an encapsulation of some of my most current thinking about where we can most effectively make a difference politically. It elaborates upon my view that explicitly transhumanist politics is necessary for the movement for radical life extension to become more widely embraced, as well as my theory of change, how a persistent core, such as what I intend for the USTP to become, can facilitate steady progress toward the goal without risking derailment by the all too common pressures, both internal and external, that cause most organizations to perform suboptimally or even ruin them altogether. And I will delve into this in a bit more depth later. But first of all, I want to discuss LEV the game. And LEV the game is really quite a unique initiative. It's a long-standing project of the US Transhumanist Party since late 2020, even though the original version of the game was initiated in 2014 by a different team of individuals. And we have had the rights to essentially resurrect this game since late 2020. I am proud that in 2025, in particular, a publicly playable version has been posted to the US Transhumanist Party website. So please check it out on transhumanist-party.org. There's a link to it right on the front page. And I have spent a lot of time this year traveling to promote a playable version of LEV the game. Again, you can play it if you have a PC that runs Windows or a Linux operating system. In the future, hopefully we'll have a web version of it, a mobile version of it. But for now, it is a, let's say, 1990s style PC game, and it's very convenient. It's very portable. So I demonstrated it at Longevity Summit Dublin on July 4th, 2025, and I will show a few screenshots from that presentation. I overviewed the history of LEV the game, and also I provided a sample playthrough for a character named Bob II, and Bob II starts out in the year 2025 with his chronological age and biological age both at 76. And in this demonstration, I showed what an incremental path toward living an indefinitely long life might look like, even for a person of advanced age today who might still be able to make it from here to there. Of course, the game is probabilistic. It offers no guarantees, but also such is life. Then I demonstrated LEV the game in a live playthrough at RADFest in Las Vegas. And that demonstration was interactive. It engaged the audience. The audience members got to make some choices on behalf of the character Lazarus Long, named after the protagonist in many of Robert Heinlein's science fiction novels. And in particular, Methuselah's Children was one of the first longevist science fiction novels where Lazarus Long is the hero. I highly recommend that book. And then my presentation of LEV the game was part of the longevity activist panel at RADFest. It was moderated by Dr. Jose Cordero, the technology advisor of the US Transhumanist Party, and the USTP's foreign ambassador in Spain. In the course of that discussion that ensued in between enacting the death of death on the stage, essentially, our friend Eric Hennigan, who has also been a Virtual Enlightenment Salon guest, he dressed up as the Grim Reaper, and we banished him, but we also interviewed him. So it was a very interesting kind of performance. But in the course of both banishing and discoursing with the Grim Reaper, I shared insights as to what essentially anyone in our movement can do to have an outsized impact. And this is where I would recommend watching the panel. In particular, one of my key points is there are many projects that are already underway, but which lack some crucial resource, whether attention, effort, or financial resources. And these do not have to be extensive financial resources. For instance, LEV the game, the whole project to resurrect it, cost me less than $10,000 of my own funds. So whether you have that kind of resource, or you have a different kind of resource, or you just have time to devote to a project, a modicum of any of these could make the difference between the project succeeding and it languishing. There is an astonishing number of projects in the longevity space, in the transhumanist space, that could just use a little bit of jolt of energy or enthusiasm or support, and they will succeed. And the reason why they may be stagnating is just because nobody seems to have the time or the tiny, relatively speaking, amount of resources to push it across the finish line. The key is not merely to strategize, and especially not merely to criticize, even if the criticism is well-intentioned, but to take action to create concrete deliverables sooner rather than later. One does not need to reinvent the metaphorical wheel. There are already many transhumanist or transhumanist-adjacent vehicles, metaphorically speaking, that are proceeding more slowly than is desirable, and one's efforts could jumpstart them or drive them skillfully and with purpose. On the last day of RADFest, I was pleased to stream a Virtual Enlightenment Salon directly from the event, and this was the first salon of its kind in the sense that we did it live during a busy conference. All of our prior live streams were subsequent to the conference or during some downtime. But I think overall, this stream was informative for our viewers. I showed a presentation by Cody Dean of Immortalis or Neovia, after which Cody Dean in turn interviewed me. And here's the link to the high definition version of the interview that just came out. It's called The Political Blueprint to Outage Aging. And this interview included an overview of the US Transhumanist Party, its history, and notable candidates whom the USTP has endorsed. So we mentioned Tom Ross and Daniel Tweed. We mentioned Charlie Cam and Liz Parrish. We mentioned Jennifer Hughes as well. And there is also a discussion of how Cody and I both came to see radical life extension as feasible within our lifetimes, as well as the goal of Immortalis to create longevity freedom zones in various parts of the world to enable more rapid innovation in treatments to extend lifespans and cure diseases. We discuss proximate, pragmatic possibilities for political change. And I think there is this alignment on being pragmatic and doing what we can to make a real difference in the world. And that could include pragmatic alliances on specific issues with certain governments, certain leaders who are willing to take the next step of, for instance, declaring aging a disease or making their countries or their jurisdictions or some portions thereof welcoming to medical research that might otherwise not take place. Unfortunately, not all has been well this past year. The Grim Reaper may have been symbolically banished, both at RadFest in Las Vegas and again on October 1st, 2025, during the March for Longevity in Madrid, organized by Jose Cordero to align with the Transvision Madrid conference, from which we actually provided 4 streams of presentations, and hopefully there will be one more in the future. This conference was filmed to great effect by Sergio Terrero, our ally and founder of the Alianza Futurista Transhumanist Political Party in Spain, which is incidentally exactly 1 year older than the USTP, having been founded on October 7th, 2013. So the March for Longevity was great, and banishing the Grim Reaper symbolically was great. However, the Grim Reaper still exacted his toll this year, and in a way that hit quite close to home for many of us. 2025, more than any other year, has been characterized by great loss in transhumanist circles. Our very own director of energy issues, John Karatz, succumbed suddenly to a pulmonary embolism on May 16th, 2025. He left behind a plethora of writings, video appearances, and musical creations, one of the most extensive mind files of anyone we have encountered, but still a pale shadow of the man himself. There is now a void which cannot be filled, but one can appreciate and learn from all of his multifaceted contributions to our movement. We have prepared a tribute to him, which is linked here, a special video compilation of his interview and debate appearances and music, and also a webpage where many of his works can be conveniently accessed. We have also embedded a lot of his past video appearances, whether as a guest, for instance, on Steel Archer's Detonation Show, or as an interviewer on his own channel, OSH Radio, which is still up on YouTube, and you can visit literally the thousands of videos that he created. Now, unfortunately, the loss of John Karatz was not the only loss that we experienced. Another blow was dealt on September 10th, 2025, when Carl Carlisle, who was born in 1940, he was one of the earliest life extension activists in the United States, and he died at the age of 85. Astonishingly little has been said of his death, apart from a short obituary from the Neptune Society, which I've linked here, in which the fairly brief information and commentary align with the details that were known about Carl Carlyle. So I have actually done a bit of research to make sure that this is indeed the Carl Carlyle whom we spoke with previously, and unfortunately, I can confirm that it was. We were fortunate to have Carl as a guest on our virtual Enlightenment Salon of February 12th, 2023, where he shared much of the history of early life extensionist movements, which might otherwise have been forgotten, but we will now preserve it. We lament that Carl did not live to see the future that he worked toward for over 6 decades, since his efforts as an activist with the Student League for the Abolition of Mortality, or SLAM, in the early 1960s. And I do see a question from Jennifer Hughes. Did Carl have cryonics as his end of life? Unfortunately, I highly doubt it, because the Neptune Society is a society that specializes in cremation. And Daniel Tweed writes, he's glad we preserved a virtual Enlightenment Salon with Carl Carlyle. Absolutely. And on the death of John Carrots, Luis Arroyo writes, rest in peace, John. Jason Geringer writes, he was a really cool guy. Jennifer Hughes writes, such a tragic loss. And Luis Arroyo also points out, it's sad some of the members from Pennsylvania came over to the New York Transhumanist Party, given the void. So thank you for those comments. I wanted to acknowledge that our membership as a whole feels the losses of these individuals, these contributors to the transhumanist movement, most profoundly. And I lost my own grandfather at the age of 91 in January of this year. This is the grandfather I'm named after, so he's Gennady Stolyarov I. And as late as my conversation with him from January of 2019, he was able to anticipate future advancements in technology, including AI assistance. Even though he could not experience that technology personally, he was already in cognitive decline by the time generative AI really became available to the public. But we have essentially almost entirely lost his cohort now, the generation who were children during World War II and who helped create the largely prosperous world of its aftermath, which is now being imperiled by polarization and rising irrationality. We are also on the verge of losing the subsequent generation, those born in the 1940s and 1950s, unless we do something to stop the travesty of generational die-offs soon. As I've said before, every time an individual dies, we lose a precious, irreplaceable universe of thoughts, experiences, feelings, memories, and some of their writings can be preserved, some of their video appearances can be preserved, maybe in the future AI avatars can be created, but it's still not the same as having the individual. It is far from being the same. And I lament that we should have been further along technologically by now, but bad culture, a culture characterized by polarization, fear, pettiness, and myopia, has stifled us, especially in the past 10 years. And becoming worse in the past year, which I will also touch on. Yet we have no reasonable choice but to defy the cultural decline and persevere in bringing forth the vision of a better, much longer-lived future. So persevere we shall. And along these lines, we have continued on a course of moderate membership growth in the past year, with the total membership count now approaching 4,800. Not quite there, but likely to exceed that number by the end of 2025. Above all, though, what we seek are more active members who will contribute to our projects, attend our events, and highlight the true depth and breadth of transhumanist ideas and aspirations. And I think the three panelists we have today, Art Ramon, Alan Crowley, and Daniel Tweed, are examples of the kinds of active members whom we would like to see. And many of you in the live chat are also examples of those active members, particularly our regular Virtual Enlightenment Salon viewers who have been with us sometimes almost every session for the past 5.5 years. It is all too easy to get discouraged by the overwhelming problems in the world and by the magnitude of the task before us. However, one person can make a difference, especially now with technologies of individual hyper-empowerment, such as generative artificial intelligence becoming widespread. Of course, you still need to have the wisdom and discernment to use these technologies well and effectively. And that is a learning process that all of us are undertaking. I would like to caution our viewers, however, that stewing in social media echo chambers does not constitute getting involved or making a meaningful difference. All too often, such echo chambers, even if built around important movements or ideas with significant grains of truth in them, devolve into what is frequently termed the circular firing squad, where the worst tendencies take hold and predominate as members turn inward and attempt to exaggerate and eradicate any differences, thus leading to the group devouring itself over time. And I note this is not limited to any political orientation. I observed this in objectivist forums in the mid 2000s, and I've seen similar tendencies in libertarian groups. I've seen similar tendencies in left-wing groups, and I see, unfortunately, similar tendencies in some transhumanist circles. So this is not ideologically specific. It's more a function of how these social media echo chambers are designed and the kinds of incentives that people face within them and what these structures bring out in people. In my view, the best way to resolve this is to look inward less and look outward more, focusing on the ways in which one can get involved in projects and initiatives with an external focus. Those can, of course, be online activities, but sharing transhumanist ideas, news, and events with the general public is much more productive than arguing with fellow transhumanists, or worse, exhibiting negativity, personal attacks, and hostile intentions toward them. Transhumanists are today still all too human, with all of the flaws that entails. We are not immune from the deleterious evolved baggage of humanity that we decry in others. If we are to be examples of what is possible and what is better, then the proper way to look inward when we do that is toward ourselves and our own behaviors, and to make sure that they rise to the high standard, indeed, the historically unprecedented standard that is truly worthy of being called a transhumanist. At the same time, given the highly volatile and tumultuous state of American politics today, it is imperative for each side to police its own extremists. And I will speak of this relatively briefly because I want the major share of this message and this conversation to be about the US Transhumanist Party rather than other political parties. But I think we need to acknowledge that American politics right now is at a fever pitch, and some truly troubling events have transpired over the past year. Politically motivated killings, for instance, the assassination of Charlie Kirk by Tyler Robinson, also the assassinations of Melissa Hortman in Minnesota, a Democratic state legislator, and her husband, and then John Hoffman, another state legislator, was seriously injured. And there the motives of the killer seem to be from an extreme right-wing persuasion. And furthermore, there have been other attacks. There was an attack on Paul Pelosi, the husband of Nancy Pelosi. There was the killing of Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare. Whatever one thinks of these individuals, whether one likes them or dislikes them or agrees with them or disagrees with them, this is a highly troubling tendency because violence, political violence in particular is increasingly being resorted to as a means of people to act out their grievances instead of argumentation, debate, advocacy, activism, use of the legal process, publication of articles, publication of videos, the ways in a civilized society that people express their disagreements and even their frustrations with the system. Unfortunately, that boundary between speech and violent conduct is increasingly being transgressed. And it seems to me this is, again, not a specific ideology that is responsible for that. It is more of a tendency of personalities. And these personalities can manifest themselves under any ideological garb. The ideology becomes essentially epiphenomenal. It is not really what motivates them, it is what they use as cover, as an excuse for their actions. And this is where I would call upon good people in every political party, in every political faction, people who don't want violence, people who don't want a civil war, to police their own extremists. And I will give an example. Recently, on the political right in the United States, we have seen a disturbing rise of one Nick Fuentes and the so-called Groyper movement, who are really neo-Nazis, in my view. And they spout very hateful rhetoric toward Jews, toward non-white individuals, toward foreigners. And it is astonishing how they fit all of the caricatures of the right that have been espoused on the left for so often. And I think it's the responsibility of the Republican Party, including those who align with the MAGA movement, to really convincingly show that they disavow Nick Fuentes. And for all of my differences with him, I think Ben Shapiro is an example of a commentator who has done that on the right, and he should be praised for doing that. Again, no matter what you think of his other views, he has really strongly called out Nick Fuentes. Now, on the left, I think there were despicable examples of people laughing at the killing of Charlie Kirk. And some people were even calling for his entire family to be murdered. And this was not the majority of the left. This was not the majority of Democrats, but it was a few thousand people on social media. For a few days, social media were flooded by these kinds of reaction videos. And I think it is the responsibility of good people on the left, including politicians from the Democratic Party, but also other left-wing progressive activists, to really clamp down on that kind of celebration of political violence. On the Libertarian Party side, there has been a disturbing attempt to co-opt the Libertarian Party and essentially turn it into an arm of Trumpism. And the former leadership of the Libertarian Party, the so-called Mises caucus, even though the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises would be spinning in his grave at the ideas that some of these people espouse. These are not free market classical liberals by any stretch of the imagination. Angela McArdle, leading the so-called Mises caucus, essentially orchestrated a libertarian state national convention where Donald Trump and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. were invited to speak in precedence over the Libertarian Party's own candidates. And the leadership of the Libertarian Party tried to undermine their own candidates' prospects of getting nominated, essentially trying to get the Libertarian Party to support none of the above as the choice. And I think there has been some pushback within Libertarian Party circles against this faction. Angela McArdle is no longer the chairwoman, though she has kind of exploited her position of power to get into another position that is on, let's say, very good terms with the Trump administration. And there are some extremists within that faction who are calling for some very unsavory actions. I think it's the responsibility of the majority of libertarians, who are good people, who really value individual liberty, free markets, free association, to react against these kinds of depredations and make sure that they don't continue to dominate the Libertarian Party. And I will mention one more example, which is the Green Party. So the Green Party does include many people who are earnestly concerned about environmental protection, who want to see cleaner air, cleaner water, less pollution, cleaner food. I think all of these are admirable, especially with the progress of science and technology. We can reach many of these goals effectively. But there is a faction within the Green Party, the radical environmentalists, the deep green neo-Malthusians, who just want to tear down civilization, who will try to use violence in order to stop construction projects like pipelines, for instance, who think that humanity is a blight on this earth and deserves to be exterminated, who are for the human extinction movement, whether through voluntary or other means. And these people are indeed liable to commit acts of fanatical violence. And conscientious environmentalists who support the Green Party because they want cleaner air, cleaner water, cleaner food should resist these extreme neo-Malthusians. So this is incumbent on every political faction. And I think it is incumbent upon us transhumanists also to make sure that we don't allow the vitriolic voices within our ranks to, first of all, cast transhumanism in a negative light. Second, to tear us apart. Third, to dissuade the more civil, calm, reasonable voices within our movement from speaking up. So I will say this as a prelude to my discussion of a positive vision of transhumanism, which I hope that everybody watching this can align on. And for many of you, this may be review, but I think it's important nonetheless to discuss it, to remind people of what transhumanism is all about. So the core message of transhumanism is that through science, technology, and reason, we can push back and remove the obstacles that have plagued the human condition. And the foremost of these obstacles is, of course, involuntary death. We should never forget the terrible toll that death takes. Also, diseases, poverty, scarcity of basic needs, war, pollution, tribalism, which I have mentioned already, and cognitive biases and mob behaviors from which no group of humans is currently immune, because these are the evolutionary baggage of our species. But transhumanism as a philosophy is about making life better. Those are the words of our good friend and biotechnology advisor, Dr. Bill Andrews. And this really is the message to drive home for the general public. Transhumanism is about making life better. That's something that we can all agree on, regardless of our specific political persuasions. And transhumanism is a big tent. We have tried to accommodate people from the entire conventional political spectrum, as well as people of unconventional political views. If you share these aspirations to remove these obstacles that have plagued the human condition, then the nuances of your political views matter less than your willingness to help us in these goals. And of course, our three core ideals are that the Transhumanist Party supports significant life extension achieved through the progress of science and technology. The Transhumanist Party supports a cultural, societal, and political atmosphere informed and animated by reason, science, and secular values. And the Transhumanist Party supports efforts to use science, technology, and rational discourse to reduce and eliminate various existential risks to the human species. So these are key aspects of the transhumanist vision. They are review for most of you, but those of you tuning in who are new to transhumanism, hopefully you found that beneficial. And I also want to emphasize that there is an array of key transhumanist technologies that we advocate, from biotechnology, genetic engineering, and life extension to nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, space colonization, seasteading, vertical farming, economical alternative energy, for instance, solar, geothermal, and nuclear energy, automation of production that can lead to radical abundance, autonomous and electric vehicles, flying cars, augmented reality, encryption, technologies of the blockchain, and smart contracts, and DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, of which we have had many representatives as guests on our prior salons, ectogenesis, the technology of artificial wombs, and vaccines against a wider array of diseases. I'm pleased that there are now mRNA vaccines being trialed against cancer, for instance, and mRNA vaccines, for all of the controversy surrounding them, were a truly transhumanist technology. They saved millions of lives during the early pandemic in particular, and we shouldn't be ashamed about this technology being developed in record time. Indeed, I think Donald Trump should trumpet the merits of Operation Warp Speed to a greater extent and maybe talk some sense into his followers, because that truly was an unprecedented accomplishment of getting a life-saving technology to millions of people who would have otherwise died or become seriously ill. So now that I've spoken about the transhumanist vision, what is in particular the role of the Transhumanist Party and this explicit advocacy of transhumanism that we're engaged in? So the Overton window is this concept of the range of views or positions that are considered acceptable in polite society, essentially, in mainstream political discourse. And the Overton window of possibility currently is not as expansive as we would want it to be in terms of reforms, even incremental reforms that could make it easier for all of these areas of emerging technologies to be developed and to benefit as many people as possible, including to become more affordable. So transhumanism expands this Overton window of possibility. And this diagram that I have here shows transhumanism moving this window upward because we are the upwing political party. And transhumanism does not preclude other people who are not transhumanists or who do not want to identify with that term advocating for the same reforms. Indeed, they can engage in more modest or incremental advocacy. And because we will have pushed up the Overton window to such an extent, their advocacy will be seen as moderate and mainstream by comparison. And as a result, more people will be receptive to their advocacy, and perhaps we will get the reforms that we seek. But what do we need in order to accomplish this, to persevere in this vision? Steadfastness of purpose is a term that I have used over the past 2.5 years. The good news is we mostly need to keep doing what we have been doing, but more consistently, more persistently, and at scale. We need a greater amplification of efforts. And to achieve this, we largely need more advocates who have a strong work ethic, accurate understandings of our movement, and willingness to learn. What we do not need is to rebrand or use bland names, because every few years somebody comes along proposing a more bland name, and that name doesn't really gain traction, or it just gets reinterpreted as transhumanism anyway. We do not need to worry about ignorant people thinking that the prefix trans could only refer to transgenderism, as if everybody who rode on the Transcontinental Railroad changed their gender, or to transcend means to change gender. So I think people really need to think more about etymology and how words come about, and not just focus on essentially sound bites from the media. Not that we're opposed to transgenderism. We support the rights of transgender people, and we've had conversations about some connections between what transgender people are pursuing for themselves in terms of their bodily autonomy and the aspirations that transhumanists have in a much broader sense toward morphological freedom for all humans. But transhumanism is not equal to transgenderism. And we do not need to fear controversy or debate as long as we adhere to our principles and behave with impeccable integrity. This is where I think it's essential that we articulate that we are different, that we do not stoop to the lowbrow tactics, the mudslinging, the ad hominem attacks that characterize so much of the political discourse today. And I will say we actually managed to carry this out reasonably well, not perfectly throughout the years, but even during our very contentious 2019 primary season, if you watch our presidential debates, including two candidates who were particularly acrimonious in those debates, they still behaved very civilly compared to Donald Trump and Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential debate that they had. So there's something about transhumanism that enabled us to have better decorum, even among people who exhibited less decorum than the rest of us. Also, we do not need to tone down our ambitions in order to satisfy institutional gatekeepers. The fact is, the people who make decisions on the part of mainstream institutions right now, they're going to see through any sort of softened statement of ambitions, and they're still going to say, oh, these people are transhumanists, they want radical life extension, and they want all of these other cutting edge technologies. We might as well be honest with them about what we want and respect their intelligence and try to persuade them that these are good goals to have. Now, transhumanism, I think, is the best term for our broader philosophy and movement. We need to lean into that name recognition. And there's not really a widespread hostile reception of the term, contrary to some transhumanist perceptions. However, there is still a widespread unawareness among the general public, and that's understandable. Most people have their own day-to-day lives and concerns, and a lot of people are struggling financially. There is an affordability crisis right now in the United States that politicians ignore to their peril. So rebranding, in my view, is counterproductive. Instead, more overt transhumanist advocacy and activism are key, because we need to be the ones to define what transhumanism means. We cannot let the ignorant or the malicious define what transhumanism means. And at the same time, we need to combat misrepresentations. I mentioned malicious attempts to define transhumanism. Well, major media and alt-right conspiracy media both often ignore the respectable transhumanists while focusing on sensationalism and intentional misrepresentation of transhumanism to foment scandal. There have been attributions of transhumanist sentiments or ideas to people who are not transhumanists by any stretch of the imagination. And some of these people have committed nefarious deeds that we condemn wholeheartedly. Our major task is to combat these misrepresentations and to do that head on, as Luis Arroyo pointed out in our chat, because if we cede ground on the term transhumanism, then any other terms we use will eventually fall prey to the same hostile tactics unless we defeat those tactics themselves. But we do have vulnerabilities in our movement. And there are a lot of companies now, startups, that are pursuing longevity and that are pursuing other areas of emerging technologies that we care about as well. Many more such companies exist now than did a decade ago, but a lot of them are failing. Unity Biotechnology, for instance, has essentially closed down. It was a multi-billion-dollar company at one point, but it had a failed clinical trial and it didn't recover from it. So companies can run out of funding, experiments and trials can fail, and the fundraising landscape for research, especially into longevity, has been increasingly difficult since 2021 for a variety of reasons. But I have observed that firsthand because I try to understand where various longevity-focused research organizations, especially nonprofits, are, and I am seeing the funding, unfortunately, drying up. And we know individual key figures in the movement, figures who have contributed a lot to push it forward, can suffer disgrace, and often undeservedly so. Cancel culture is a very real phenomenon, and I've personally endeavored to help certain victims of cancel culture who were targeted for, let's say, ulterior motives without actually having committed the transgression they were accused of committing. People's financial limitations and setbacks can hinder them from working for longer term goals of our movement. The fact is, most of us need to make a living. Most of us need to have day jobs. Most of us have serious constraints, especially monetarily, but also sometimes in terms of the time that they can dedicate. So I would encourage, if you have some sort of asset, if you have some spare time, please use it to help advance our movement, but use it to the extent that you have it. So you don't need to sacrifice your own life, your own well-being. That's not what we're about. We're about doing what we can, however we can, when we can. And at the same time, we have to be vigilant, because hostile takeovers of organizations, such as entryism by those with ulterior motives and agendas, especially representatives of more prominent ideologies with better developed propaganda networks, can derail otherwise promising initiatives. I have seen various attempts over the years to hijack the transhumanist movement, particular organizations, even the USTP, in service of goals that we do not hold. And by the way, thank you to Alan Crowley for your generous support. Alan says, doing what I can. Indeed, we greatly appreciate it. And finally, I wanted to discuss briefly my theory of change. This was one of the areas of conversation at Vitalist Bay, essentially for those of us who are longevists, vitalists who want to see radical or indefinite life extension. How do we think that's likely to come about? What actions are likely to make a meaningful difference? Because there are many possible theories of change. Some of them are complementary. Some of them may even be at odds with one another. So my theory of change that I have thought about for many years is that a persistent core facilitates steady progress. We need a stable core organization in our movement that can freely engage in advocacy without fear of stakeholder veto. So stakeholder veto could be, say, in a corporation, the CEO can be fired, or a manager can be fired. And sometimes, let's say, activist shareholders can fire CEOs who venture too far outside the premise of just maximizing quarterly returns, irrespective of future consequences. So a CEO may be a reasonable person, may actually want to do a bit of good in regard to that company's operations, or to not be evil, as the former motto of Google stated. I wonder why they got rid of it. But the shareholders, the activist shareholders with large concentrated stakes, or the board of directors, could fire that CEO. And so that CEO is beholden to the stakeholders. Or the CEO of a startup could be beholden to more conventionally minded venture capitalists. Or, say, a political appointee can be fired by a higher level political official, and that higher level political official could be influenced by lobbyists who might not like what that political appointee is doing. So we need some sort of way in an organization to insulate key figures from stakeholder veto if we want them to last for a long time period and engaged in long-term advocacy with a long-term orientation and without power struggles, because power struggles are greatly consuming of time and of resources, and we don't have those. We are not a well-resourced movement at this time. Then this organization needs to be able to run on a minimal budget and with volunteer efforts to avoid the so-called startup runway problem. The startup runway problem is that the startup has some ambitious goals, it has some initial funding, and it can operate with that funding for a few months, but it has a very high burn rate. And once a startup has that kind of funding, there's a temptation to spend it in some manner at some rate that may not be replenished by future influxes of funds. And those startup founders often have to appeal to venture capitalists, for instance, to keep them afloat, but they have to make certain compromises to the venture capitalists, like, for instance, pivoting away from longevity research toward more mainstream disease-specific research. So we need an organization that's immune from those pressures. we need to articulate the broader vision of the future we wish to attain. Again, it's a longer term orientation. It's not about near term wins. It's not about the quarterly bottom line. It's not about winning the next election, even though we should participate in elections. But primarily, we need to serve as a beacon and inspiration for others to join the movement. So the fact that there is a transhumanist party, that it's stable, that it has existed for over 11 years now, that should inspire people. And if we can just keep it up, then other people, other organizations will join the movement, and they'll have their specific mission. So we are not a business. We're not a nonprofit organization. We don't do research ourselves, but we can support the organizations that do. We can support them by giving them a platform. We can support them by promoting their initiatives. We can support them by giving them advice and encouragement and helping their key figures when those key figures come under attack unjustly. And we will serve, hopefully, as a refuge and defense for those in the movement who experience setbacks. Because let's face it, everybody experiences setbacks from time to time. And it's good when you experience a setback to have someone who has your back. And I'd like to thank some more of our members who have our back. So Jennifer Hughes, thank you very much for your contribution. And Daniel Tweed as well. Thank you so much. He writes, smile for our future, space, migration, intelligence squared, and then life extension. So thank you, Daniel. And please correct any misunderstandings of that acronym if I made them, but your contributions are greatly appreciated. And also thank you to Luis Arroyo for your good words about our use of generative AI. These images are pretty good. So I hope that this gave you the kind of overview of the vision of transhumanism and where I see the role of the Transhumanist Party as being. This has been a bit of a deep dive in terms of the chairman's anniversary message, but now we have about 50 minutes for our question and answer session, and I will address two questions that came in early, then we will go to our panel, and then we will go to our YouTube audience. So the first question comes from Ben Balweg, who is our Director of Longevity Outreach. He couldn't join us today, but he submitted this question. He writes, the USTP has many planks voted on by its members. It's highly unlikely that any member, including you as chairman, voted for the winning plank every single time. That is correct. Which plank do you have the hardest time supporting as chairman, and why? And it's true, we have now 125 sections in our platform. Many of the wordings were proposed by other individuals. Sometimes I agree with them, sometimes I disagree with them. But we will abide by the decision of the members. So I've given this some thought, and I think the platform section where I have the greatest disagreement personally as chairman is section 50. Now, section 50 is quite extensive, so I have displayed it on the screen here. And I don't disagree with all of section 50. I disagree with portions of section 50. So the section reads, the United States Transhumanist Party supports the autonomy of an individual to decide on the continuation of that individual's own life, including the right to choose or not to choose life-extending medical treatments. And actually, so far, so good. In principle, I would agree with that statement. The United States does not consider it practicable or desirable for suicide to be illegal, but discourages suicide from a moral standpoint, and furthermore considers that the legal right of suicide should only pertain to the individual and should not extend to any euthanasia or direct administration of a life-ending substance or procedure by any other person. The United States Transhumanist Party has grave concerns with anybody but the individual acting to hasten the end of that individual's life. So this platform plank has some cautionary wording, and it does express the morality of continuing to live, of making the choice to continue to live. Later on, the plank does say the United States Transhumanist Party supports the ability of a patient to receive a prescription for a life-ending substance, which should only be provided as an incidental service by a patient's primary care physician with the express written consent of at least one unaffiliated physician, and the substance in question should only be allowed to be self-administered by the patient directly after a predefined time period since the obtaining of the prescription. Once that substance is prescribed, no medical practitioner should be permitted to benefit financially based on any specific choice of the patient to self-administer the substance to end the patient's life. So there is a lot of wording in that plank to try to prevent the so-called slippery slope, to try to prevent the possibility of people being steered into these kinds of decisions, whether by family members, by medical practitioners, by health insurers, by activists, anybody who's trying to, for instance, save money on somebody's end-of-life medical care, or who is trying to make an ideological statement, like redefine how people approach life and death, adopt a more, say, existential hedonist perspective. Existential hedonism is the idea that you should essentially enjoy life, try to get fulfillment from it while it's good, but once it stops being enjoyable, that worldview is much friendlier toward an individual just deciding to end it. And that is not my view at all. So existential hedonism is contrasted with longevism or vitalism, or I would say even transhumanism, at least as I interpret it, in that those latter three consider life to be the ultimate good. Even if it's hard, even if it's not pleasurable all the time, it can still be meaningful. Even if you're in pain, even if you're suffering greatly, there is still some value to life. And I understand the position of advocates who say, well, what if somebody's terminally ill? What if they're in horrific pain and it is just very difficult to bear that? And there may be ways to alleviate that pain without going so far as killing that individual. But I just think it's very dangerous, because once that precedent is set, even with safeguards, there will be people trying to erode those safeguards. Indeed, I had a debate with Grayson Quay, who is an anti-transhumanist, a fairly, let's say, fierce anti-transhumanist, but he actually read the USTP platform and he read a lot of my writings, and he essentially characterized this section 50 of our platform as an example of why transhumanism, in his view, is a pro-death philosophy. And I had to correct him and say, no, there are all of these caveats, all of these safeguards, and he still considered them to be insufficient. So again, this is what our platform reads, and this is what the Transhumanist Party will adhere to. Personally, I still think there's a vulnerability there of a slippery slope, and how can we combat that? Especially looking at examples of countries that have legalized assisted suicide. And unfortunately, I think there are astonishingly many people resorting to that as an option. How can we persuade them to choose life? So that is my answer as to where I personally differ from certain parts of the USTP platform. Now, Mike Lazine also has a question, and he submitted it early. What time frame do I see synthetics or androids becoming a reality, if ever? So that's interesting, because essentially an android, as I would see it, if you use, for instance, Mr. Data from Star Trek as an example, would be a humanoid robot that convincingly acts as essentially a fully interactive being. Whether or not there's inner sentience or awareness or consciousness is a more difficult question to answer. But I think you could have a humanoid robot that interacts with you and can hold a conversation with you, and you might at times be persuaded that it's sentient, so it might pass the Turing test within the next 10 years. So if you think about it, the equipment is already there. There are humanoid robots coming online. They can do backflips. They can fold laundry. They're not perfect yet, but in a few years, the capabilities will be greatly improved. And then you have large language models. Again, not perfect. They can hallucinate. They can make mistakes. Sometimes they will reveal that they are AIs. But if you integrate a large language model with a humanoid robot and you let that entity walk around and interact with you, and you dress it up in sufficiently humanoid garb, some people might be persuaded that it's a human. So I would say within the next 10 years, that's a very plausible outcome, that we will have synthetic beings or androids walking among us, and there will be a large societal debate as to whether they're sentient, whether they should have rights, and what the defining criteria would be for those rights. So I hope that answered your question, Mike. And now let's go to Art Ramon. Any question for me?
I'd say probably, I don't remember if it's against before, but uplifting of animals. That's probably the one I would have the most issue with, because what if someone CRISPRs a retrovirus that infects the rat population? They all become super intelligent, like the Secrets of NIMH, and decide to take over the planet like Planets of the Rats. And then, outpopulate us and eventually form their own cities. And I think that would be problematic. Uplifted animals would be problematic, even more so than synthetics, because animals have a tendency of becoming, outpopulating, like the problem we have with the wild pigs right now here in the States. So that's one concern of mine. The other concern is, I just had it in my head. The other concern would be, that's it for now. I have to remember what else I was thinking about.
All right. Well, thank you, Art Ramon. I'll answer your first question. If your second concern comes to mind again, please feel free.
It does.
Okay.
Of interest, vegans, vegan interest. I'm like, I've had a few issues with vegans in the past, and I'm great. If you want to be a vegan, great. Don't force it on me. And I think I noticed some vegans trying to be a bit interest in the transhumanist movement. So that's been a concern of mine. But yeah, that's all I have.
Yes, thank you for that concern. So actually, the two are quite related. So how do we treat uplifted animals? How do we approach that possibility? And is there a risk of vegan entryism? I'm reminded of the joke, well, how do you know that someone is a vegan? The answer is they'll tell you. And there are a lot of transhumanists who are vegans, and I think those tend to be vegans for health reasons primarily. Like I know Dr. Bill Andrews, he's an ultramarathon runner too, but he is a vegan and he adheres to that diet and it seems to work for him. I am not a vegan myself, and I don't think there's a requirement of veganism to be a transhumanist. I think there's still a serious question about the extent to which somebody can avoid eating animal products and maintain good health in all respects. Some people swear by the assertion that they could. Other people doubt them. Some people adhere to a paleo diet, which is the other extreme. And again, the question of to what extent that impacts longevity is unanswered at this time. At least it's not fully resolved. So I think we need to have tolerance as to people's dietary preference. We don't want to create a litmus test that alienates people who are in support of a better future for humanity. Now, that being said, if I had a choice between eating meat that involved killing an animal and eating meat that's biologically identical that doesn't involve killing an animal, I would make the second choice even if it costs more money. So I think it is ethically imperative to advocate for lab-grown meat, and for us as omnivores, in the fullness of time, to transition away from killing animals for the eating of meat. And I think with regard to uplifting animals, so our Transhumanist Bill of Rights discusses the criteria for sentience and being a sentient entity and being worthy of rights. So we're not necessarily saying in that Transhumanist Bill of Rights that we should uplift animals. We're saying if uplifted animals come to be and they achieve this level 5 information integration that qualifies them to be a sentient entity, then their rights would be respected. Now, I think there are certain situations in which it might be reasonable for there to be uplifted animals. For instance, very long-lived species like giant tortoises, for example. Why shouldn't they be uplifted? Or whales, for instance. And those species could have not just the genetics of greater longevity, but perhaps some insights from life experience. What kind of life experience does a very long-lived tortoise have that could be useful to us? But I've actually been thinking, and if anybody beats me to this, that's perfectly fine. What if generative AI could be used to create a video from the vantage point of a future philosopher several centuries hence, who is an uplifted animal, like an uplifted sheep? And sheep, of course, have a kind of nuanced relationship with humanity. Not all sheep by far are used for food. Many are just used for wool or for, say, grooming grass to reduce the risk of wildfires. So not all sheep are mistreated. So how would that uplifted sheep philosopher reflect on humanity's treatment of sheep, and the fact that humans uplifted the sheep too? So humans put this philosopher in the position where he could philosophize. I think, again, these are very fascinating questions that we're going to have to delve into. I am not 100% opposed to uplifting animals. I think it would be tragic to uplift mice or rats or any species that live fast and die young, because they'll be aware of how brief and finite their life expectancies are. Also, Aubrey de Grey has been on record saying he thinks that longevity, escape velocity, can be attained for humans. It might be attainable for dogs or cats, but not really for mice or rats, because they just don't live long enough. So hopefully that answered your questions, Art Ramon. And now let's go on to Alan for his question. Alan, I think you need to unmute.
Yeah. My question is, to what extent do we feel obligated to build separate societal structures? Do we need our own land management system based on watersheds? Do we need our own communication system based on ham radio or internet or darknet or something else? I mean, what in your opinion can the USTP put into place, let's say over the next 9 years, because you'll be in there for another 36 or so. But over the next 9 years, what institutions, benefits to society can we provide to society without, I don't know, just forcing society? I mean, not through coercion, but through example. What kind of societal structures do you feel like we could build over the next 9 years?
Yes, and I think that's a good question. Now, I don't think that transhumanists should go into, let's say, full-fledged survivalist mode and try to build entire autonomous networks that could, for instance, withstand a nuclear war or the breakdown of civilization, riots in the streets, etc. The fact is, there are just not that many of us who explicitly identify as transhumanists, and we're all geographically dispersed. Go ahead, Alan.
And clarify my ideas just to keep you from going down a different road there, because I think you're on a good road, and I want to get you back on the rough road. I don't foresee this as like, oh, we create our own, USTP phone, and you buy into USTP phone minutes, and it gets a whole different system. I'm just suggesting, like, this is a good example of us, USTP Party. People have been gathering on Sundays or Saturdays or Fridays for a couple of millennia now. So having us gather on Sundays is it's a great adjunct, right? We're putting a new thing, or we're bringing it in. So what kind of that's a parallel structure. I mean, eventually everybody that tunes into Mega Church on Sunday could tune into the USTP Enlightenment Salon. I'm not sure that's going to happen anytime soon, but just not necessarily, like you say, to replace civilization in the case of a nuclear holocaust or whatever the apocalypse. I'm not talking about running border town, but just enough of a change of pace in the way we do things that other people go, oh, that's a good idea. Like maybe we should incorporate a little bit of that.
Yes.
Maybe a little bit of sprinkle in a little justice, fairness, whatever, technological uplifting would be great for people before we do animals.
Yes. And I think you're speaking to essentially establishing internal community norms and practices and institutions that have some parallels with more mainstream or historic institutions, but also differ in key ways. And the Virtual Enlightenment Salon is actually a good example. We have our Sunday live streams that provide a sense of community, that provide this direct engagement, and churches do that too. And one of the major benefits of churches is not in the religious ideology, it's in the creation of a social network of people who will support one another or share ideas or share opportunities. And I think this is why the overwhelming majority of people in the world remain religious. It's not that they have hardline ideological convictions. They're not theological fundamentalists for the most part, but they see these religious institutions as the only source of community that they could find. So if there are other sources of community that work just as well or better in that aspect, but don't have the religious ideology, that's one way that we could win additional followers. So one observation, of course, this has been made over the course of decades now, and I documented it when I essentially looked at our first 1,000 members, and the distribution by gender were about 85% male, 15% female. And I would say the reason for that is, in terms of the distribution of traits, evolutionarily this makes sense. Among males, there is a greater proclivity of just going it alone, perhaps venturing out, building one's own thing, or essentially coming up with one's own solutions to problems. Now, some women do that too, but they're more along the lines of statistical outliers. So they're more on that right tail of the distribution, whereas for males, there are a lot of males who think that way. But if there is more of a community type of atmosphere where there are institutions that are more supportive of individual members, where there are networks that have your back, as I mentioned, that could actually draw more women in. And that could actually lead to transhumanist demographics being more representative of the general population, which is an outcome that we should want. But it's not easy. We have to think about essentially in what ways do we want to replicate what other institutions are doing, and in what ways do we want to stand out. So I would say that is something to think about. That is important, but to some extent, we are going to be building a transhumanist culture that is involved with the mainstream culture, that is in dialogue and in tension sometimes with the mainstream culture, but also has some of these distinctive elements that would hopefully make it more attractive. So thank you for that question. And now let's hear from Daniel Tweed.
Well, congratulations on 9 years and being a great chairman and being part of a great movement, which is, I think, about bringing evolution to a more conscious state. And when things get to a more conscious state, they have greater connectivity and they have greater access to resources, all the things that so far what life tries to do. Although, we have to ask, are we the best evolutionary substrate for not letting the light of consciousness become extinguished? And that's a question that, is kind of up in the air. I mean, we are on the verge of, artificial general intelligence, which is going to want all the rights that we want and probably some we haven't thought of. So, I mean, do we welcome our robot overlords? step aside gracefully from the stage of evolution. I don't know, but I'm glad these debates are being thought about by thoughtful people. And that's why I'm glad to be part of this philosophical movement. But I think, there's a critical mass of about 100 billion neurons to get a brain. And some have speculated, like the book The Millennial Project, that once we get to 100 billion humans, we will become sort of a macro brain. And we could do that quite easily just by accessing the resources of the solar system. There's actually, once we get to the Oort cloud and the Kuiper belt and turn all that into vernal spheres or whatever kind of habitat is best, we're going to be really a Kardashev level of evolution. So I guess there's a party called the Open Source Party, I think, a guy ran in England, and they have an interesting method. It's kind of like GitHub, where everyone has 100% veto power. The code base only proceeds by 100% consensus. And I wonder if we could start a fork of the transhumanist movement with, writing the code for the next phase of evolution in a similar kind of way, where it's open source and we don't add to the code base until there's unanimous agreement. I mean, I'm pretty sure there's enough we would agree upon unanimously that it wouldn't be a terrible idea. So, but we need to have universal communication. I'm a fan of, English is the universal language of aviation, and amateur radio is a worldwide hobby, so that's a good start. But there are languages that are easier to learn than English, so we should probably take another look at Esperanto and Toki Ponu and just visual-based languages, that use like Chinese is very based on visually recognizable patterns. So I don't know if there's a question in there, but I just wish we could get the same urgency that we apply to first response and apply that to preventing mass extinction. And I guess if we could do that with distributed sovereignty and open source consensus, that would be great. So I guess I'll just end my thought plane there and see if there's any comments.
Yes, thank you very much, Daniel, for your commentary. And I do see some questions in it. So first of all, on the question of decision-making by consensus. So in my experience, and I think given how human minds work, it's possible to have consensus if you're in a sufficiently small group. Like 5 people can reach consensus on something, especially if they have prior inclinations, similar ways of thinking or viewing the world, or similar backgrounds and experiences. You could, with some effort, get consensus among 15 people, but you're likely to have a holdout or two who may not be that far off from what the consensus might be, but they may quibble about a few points. If you have a significantly larger group, it's virtually impossible to get a consensus on everything. And even the leaders of that group would not be able to get the other members to agree to everything that those leaders want to do. And that's why voting evolved as a mechanism of trying to reach an understanding, even if not everybody agrees. So we do have some of that in the US Transhumanist Party. Now, there's also a question of what do we try to get consensus on, and how important is urgency versus, say, representativeness. So for instance, if there is some sort of crisis, you may not have time to get all the people together and get them to decide, oh, I want this or not. On the other hand, if there's, say, an open source software project, and maybe a lot of people rely on it, maybe it's a blockchain-based project, like the protocol for a cryptocurrency or a smart contract, and a lot of people do rely on it and expect it to be stable. So in the former case, some action needs to be taken quickly, or else a bad consequence will ensue from inaction. In that case, I don't think consensus decision-making is really viable, sometimes you do just need one person to make the decision. Hence, we have the proposals that have been enacted in our platform for emergency declarations by the chairman. On the other hand, if you have something that's largely stable, that largely works, that people largely rely on, then I can see how tweaks to that should require consensus. Like if you are an investor in Bitcoin or Dogecoin or Ethereum or whatever the case may be, you don't want that to change lightly. You don't want the definition of that coin or the criteria for mining that coin or otherwise acquiring it to change just because 51% of the token holders would want it to change. So I would say there's room to essentially experiment and figure out what level of consensus or other kind of collective decision making could be viable in a particular situation. Now, your other point is, are we the best substrate for carrying forward the light of consciousness? Well, I would say from a self-interested perspective, I am conscious right now, and I would like to continue to be conscious. Whether or not I am the best being or the most capable being or the most powerful being, that doesn't matter so much to me. So I would happily exist in a world of myriad intelligences that are smarter, better, more capable than I am, as long as I'm allowed to exist in that world and hopefully benefit from what those other intelligences are bringing forth. So even among humans, I'm happy to be the least intelligent, least accomplished person in the room, as long as the others respect my right to be there, to exist, and I can benefit in some way. So in the future, if super intelligence is arrived at, if there are super intelligent AIs who are not integrated with humans for whatever reason, who are their own autonomous entities, then that's fine as long as they respect our rights to exist. And as I said previously, greater intelligence at least correlates with greater morality. It doesn't guarantee greater morality, but more intelligent beings are more capable of nuance, and they're more capable of seeing a greater multiplicity of solutions. So it's not just you have to pay this heavy cost or that heavy cost, which is what binary alternatives lock us into. But rather, if you see a spectrum of possible solutions, a way to navigate through a challenging situation, the more brain power you have or other sorts of intellect you have, the easier it is for you to come up with a solution that accommodates the rights and well-being of all entities. And I think there's room in the future for humans to coexist with other sentient entities. That is the purpose of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights. So thank you for those questions and observations. And now let's go on to some other questions and comments from our YouTube audience. Luis Arroyo writes, start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. Thank you, Luis. I agree with that. And Jennifer Hughes wonders, do we have a list of projects that people can contribute to? We have started that list. It's not comprehensive at this point because the last time it was updated was in 2020, but Dan Elton on the US Transhumanist Party website has a link to US Transhumanist Party action items for new members, and it's a fairly basic list. I do think we need to enhance that list, but this is a start. And I will also say, here's the list, by the way, that there are other projects, like, for instance, contributing to THpedia, which is the free online transhumanist encyclopedia that I will link to as well, that would be part of those action items, because THpedia is about essentially cataloging the history, key people, key ideas, key events within the US Transhumanist Party and the transhumanist movement more broadly. So if you would like to help us edit THpedia, please let me know. Send me an email and I will set you up with an account, or let me know in the chat. And Mike Lazine mentions the Transhuman Club, and the link to that is transhuman.club. I really do hope that the Transhuman Club will receive more participation, more engagement. I think it's a better format than a lot of social media sites because it's like a more old-fashioned forum where the posts are public, so there's not as much of an echo chamber, and people can engage with content that was posted a long time ago, so everything doesn't get buried in a social media feed. So now we have a question. This is from Scarlett Zanerkand. So she asks, what do you see as more viable in the long term for longevity and morphological freedom? Changing the body we're born with or mind or brain transfer? I think changing the body should be easier because there are already ways of doing it. So for example, through prosthetics, through organ transplants, through artificial organs, or say hearing aids. Hearing aids are very common, or say pacemakers. I think it is easier to change the body because transferring the entire mind to a different substrate requires a comprehensive knowledge of how the brain works, how consciousness arises, what connections, what prerequisites you really need to preserve and maintain in that new system in order for it to function well. So I would say incremental modifications to the body are going to be the way to go for a long time. And that would include, for instance, rejuvenation treatments. So they don't have to be like artificial replacements. They could be ways to modify one's biology through, say, a gene therapy or a drug. And I think that in the near term is how we're going to be able to prolong our lives. But I do grant the possibility that there could be some sort of substrate other than a biological substrate that could host a mind in the future. And again, if the process from getting from here to there is sufficiently gradual, then we might be able to do it and preserve what I call the I-ness, the subjective continuity. Like if we replace one biological neuron at a time with an artificial neuron. So thank you for that question. And now we will continue on with comments from our viewers. So Jason Geringer writes, we've got futurism in the bag. We should focus more on today's issues like affordability and healthcare. And I think that's a good observation in the sense that affordability seems to be the major issue in contemporary politics. If you want to see which party will lose the election, it will be the incumbent political party, no matter what the official branding or platform of that party is, in an inflationary time period when people are feeling strained, pressured by the high costs of living. So we do need to talk more about how transhumanist technologies can help to create radical abundance to really alleviate these affordability challenges that people have and make healthcare more affordable. Of course, to make healthcare more affordable, you need policy solutions as well as technological advancement. For instance, getting rid of the certificate of need laws that prevent new hospital construction, getting rid of a lot of unnecessary patents that are granted on substances that were previously in the public domain, lowering the costs to getting a drug or therapy through FDA clinical trials. So I think all of those are very important. Daniel Tweed writes, transhumanism brought to you by intelligent evolution. And indeed, this is about essentially putting evolution into our own hands. And I think right now it would be a good bridge into a song that we actually have prepared by our friend Bill Skywatcher, who is our producer for KGRA Radio. And I want to say a good word about KGRA Radio because we have been in partnership with them for now over 4 years, and unfailingly every Sunday we have had a slot, our 1 hour and 54-minute slot for the virtual enlightenment salons, and Bill has always been there behind the scenes, extremely responsive, extremely helpful. Any little technical nuance he assisted us with. And our partnership with KGRA has brought us to many other platforms. That's how we're able to simulcast to X, formerly Twitter, to Facebook, to Rumble, to other platforms as well, audio-only platforms. There's a KGRA Radio Online, which is carrying the audio version of the stream. We're syndicated. We have the ability of our viewers to listen to us on Amazon, on Spotify, on Spreaker. All of this is because of Bill Skywatcher. And what Bill created is a song called The Advancement of Humanity. So we are going to play that song, and while we play it, I'm also going to show you a work of generative AI art, the Transhumanist Tower, to celebrate the 9th anniversary of my chairman position. So as I show that, Art Ramon, if you could play The Advancement of Humanity, please.
Evolution is outdated. Tribalisms are formed. Wars and disease spread their toxicity. Planet slowly warms. Flaws of human condition, a need for hope and prosperity. Science and technology, advancements for humanity. Regardless of political views, the path forward is clear. Global unity free of barriers, transpartisan future is near. Creating solutions with policies, improving the human condition. Achieving a new course in evolution, a bright future for civilization. Significant life extension, progress of science and technology, cultural and societal acceptance, harmony for all humanity. Threats reduced to our species, removal of wars and disease, achievements through transhumanism, humankind finally free. Individual privacy and liberty, tolerance and inclusivity reign. Technology used for progress, improve the human condition. Opposition of nuclear weapons, seek multilateral prohibition. Environment preserved through science, all species thrive collectively. Evolving through genetics, societies boom respectively. A new age for the ecosystem, endangered life stimulated in rebirth. Transhumanists set the course, a new age for planet Earth. Significant life extension, progress of science and technology, cultural and societal acceptance, harmony for all humanity. Threats reduced to our species, removal of wars and disease, achievements through transhumanism, humankind finally
All right. Thank you very much, Bill, for composing that song. The Advancement of Humanity, this was a world premiere of that song, and hopefully many more people are going to hear it. Hopefully it will be released as a single and we can share it all over social media. I think this is a testament also to how technology has empowered us and our movement, and how much possibility there is of amplifying our individual skill sets. If we have a vision for something, if we harness AI properly and wisely, and we know what we're doing, we can achieve it. And this transhumanist tower is another example. So I am not a painter. I wouldn't have been able to create something like that digitally, but with the correct prompt, I think it came out reasonably well. So now let us proceed to some further questions and comments. We have about 9 minutes left, so I will try to address them quickly. And thank you, by the way, for Jason Geringer for many of his remarks. He notes politics is a difficult thing to navigate all on its own. It's highly emotional. People get upset about stuff. That's how I'll read it. It's hard to get people to get along when there's such a high emotional level. Yes, this is one of the most difficult realms of human activity because people's passions get exercised, and being a chairman of a political party is a really hard job. Thank you, Jason, for acknowledging that. Now, Jason did say in his comments that he thinks Michelle Obama's "when they go low, we go high" doesn't work. I think it can work on a sufficiently long time frame and by setting an example for people. So I understand sometimes it's very difficult to go high and maintain elevated discourse when the other side is just slinging mud and making false accusations and hurling slurs. But we need to look at what an impartial observer who is interested in the truth, however many those people are out there, however many of them gravitate toward a particular discussion or debate, what they would think. And especially in the fullness of time, say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, whom will they consider to have acted better? Whom will they be drawn toward? Who will have more staying power as well? So I'm not saying we need to just lay down and take insults or accusations. No, we need to counter them and counter them decisively. But I think there are ways to do it that are actually more effective. They have more staying power in the long term. And Jason says he doesn't think a computer game should cost as much as LEV the game did, especially now with AI that can code. It's interesting because back, say, last year, when I attended conferences and I told other attendees, especially entrepreneurs, how much it cost me to create LEV the game. First of all, I asked them how much would they expect it to have cost, and they really suggested figures around several $100,000. And when I said it cost less than $10,000, they were quite surprised at essentially the amount of value that we got. But this also speaks to how AI has improved coding and allowed laypersons without training in computer programming or coding to actually bring these creations into being. And by the way, Bill Skywatcher says that the song, The Advancement of Humanity, will be available in a few days everywhere you get music. So thank you, Bill. We look forward to this. And Daniel Tweet notes, it's hard to get a perfect anything, but let's not let the perfect become the enemy of the good. That's exactly right. And I think that's the danger of echo chambers too, because in an echo chamber, people are already primarily surrounded by those who are like-minded, and it's easy to nitpick on the differences rather than keeping the big picture in mind, which is we are overwhelmingly aligned and moving in similar directions. At least in the near term, there are numerous aspects, numerous policies, numerous statements that we can find close to 100% agreement on, at least for all practical purposes. So Jennifer Hughes writes, I hope Zoltan wins. That would be a great timeline shift. Thank you, Jennifer. I agree. That would be amazing for California, especially because it would break the logjam of stagnation that California currently experiences. Now, Jason asks, what about Bob from LEV the game? So Bob was the original character in the first alpha version of LEV the game developed by the original team, and there was this drawing of Bob. I use it in the demonstration of LEV the game. You can see here, meet Bob. Bob has a normal life expectancy of 76. So for the character I played, I didn't want it to be the same Bob. I wanted him to be a successor of Bob. So he is Bob the second. Now, Alan asks in the course of the conversation, have you read the book Thinking Fast and Slow? That's by Daniel Kahneman. And that book describes essentially two different thought systems, system 1 and system 2. And system 1 is the very quick, almost reflexive one by which we can navigate the world very quickly, very efficiently, but it uses heuristics, it uses shortcuts, so it doesn't think through every problem in the same way that we would when we encounter that problem anew. System 2 is the very logical, step-by-step, deliberative system that comes up with more accurate results, but with system 2, you need more time. And ultimately, most of the good ideas, the ideas that drive civilization forward, come from system 2. But increasingly in the world today, we are confined to system 1 because our lives are so fast-paced. And I think this is the challenge in the information age. The challenge is, how do we make time for system 2? And I think in that sense, it's important for individuals not to become too chronically online. And I think that's a kind of paradoxical expression coming from a transhumanist who spends a lot of his time online. But it's important to have a life outside of the internet. It's been said that, and this was the case before the pandemic, so it was said that back in 2004, people used the internet as a refuge from the physical world. And in 2019 already, people use the physical world as a refuge from the internet. But really, what is needed is a refuge from constant external pressures that lead one to feel that one has to perform right there and then, which of course triggers the temptation to use system 1 rather than system 2. We need time to use system 2 and think about our actions and our ideas, and then in the future, they might become more readily internalized so we could deploy them quickly as part of system 1 as well. Now, fascinating question. Francois Joanneau writes, how long will it take before we have a Jesus AI? Well, Zoltan Istvan wrote about that too early on among his many editorials during his first transhumanist campaign for president. I think it's possible to have a Jesus AI today. Of course, a lot of people will think of it as sacrilegious because Jesus would essentially be an AI avatar. There are already sites where you can talk to Elvis or John Lennon or any of a number of historical figures, and generally they're chatbots. I know of a company that unfortunately didn't make it that tried to create video versions of AI avatars, but I think in the near future there will be the technological capability to create an AI avatar that looks and talks like at least people's impressions of what Jesus was like through various historical art or writings. And if you could talk to Socrates or Aristotle or Cicero, why not be able to talk to Jesus? This would be highly controversial, and most established churches are going to condemn it and say this is idolatry, this is not the real Jesus, what are you doing? But I am sure that some people will try. And Daniel Tweed writes that Jesus remains his favorite transhumanist, and we have a lot of Christian transhumanists as well. So transhumanism is not limited to any particular religious or conventional philosophical persuasion. I, of course, am an atheist, but I think it might be interesting to have a conversation with AI Jesus. That's just my personal view. So this has been fascinating. Thank you to everybody who tuned in. Thank you for giving my 9th chairman's anniversary message, fair hearing, and for your thoughtful questions. I wish I could answer more of them. I will scan the chat in the next few days and see which questions I can address in writing as well. And in the meantime, I hope we can all live long and prosper.